Hello Mountaineers, I'm Jordan from Mountway Finance, talking about property yield and capital return and how these mix with your property investment strategy, why they matter, how it influences things. So we have basically two sorts of types of return effectively you can get for any investment. Yield represents the income that flows from that investment. And in the context of property, yield is about rent. So rent is a function of the property value. That's a function of the money you need to put in to buy that property in the first place. And so if we talk about rent yield, it ends up being the annual rent divided by property value, right? So if we consider a property, let's say, well, it could be any capital city nowadays, given the way property prices are, but if we have a property value of $1 million, and I'm using round numbers because it's easier, right? And the annual rent is $30,000. That's a 3% rental yield. Let me just make sure I've done those numbers correctly. Yes, that's a 3% rental yield, $30,000 per annum. Now, what does that translate to per week? Divided by 5, that's about $600 a week, right? Not exactly, but around about. Okay. Does that sound about right for a $1 million property in Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, for example? Probably is about right, $600 a week. Now, this is yield, right? This is how much you earn. Think about how much your interest costs. We're here now in May 2026. We've just had a rate rise. The Reserve Bank's gone to 4.35%. The banks are now lifting their rates in response to something like 6. Well, we're talking about investments here. So it's about 6.25%. Interest alone on the debt on that property costs you 6.25%. And let's say you borrow 8%, which is about the standard. So you're paying for debt on 80% or 800,000 of that purchase, right? And the easy way to sort of compare your rent yield to your interest rate is to times that by 80%, which would be 1.5, so it would be sort of 4.75% is effectively kind of like what you're paying, just in interest. You've still got to pay the principal, which is on top of that, right? So this is a negatively geared property. This property on the loan itself alone, let alone rates, agent fees, management fees, which are like 5 to 7%. Insurance, did I mention that? Yes. Anyway, all those property expenses go into this. And so while you get 3% and you pay 4.75% in interest on your debt, then in addition, you might pay another, let's say, 7 to 10% in costs. This is highly negatively geared. This will actually suck cash out of your cash flow each and every month that you own the property until that debt is repaid, right? So that's what yield looks like. Now, obviously, we can look at yield in a different environment, not a capital city where, we might be looking at something like 10%. It exists. And 10% is obviously a very, very different story. You might get something close to cash flow neutral or cash flow positive. 10% would see us earning $100,000 of rent per year, and then something like $2,000 of rent per week. Now, trust me, I come from Karratha in the remote northwest of the country, mining area. Housing is scarce. Companies want people to put their employees, and the rents do get up to that level. And at that level, you can potentially pay for your loan, depending on interest rates, depending on what you borrow, whether it's 50% or 100%. But you're much closer to being positively geared with that yield, with that 10%. So when you look at that, you go, all right, a capital city, 3% is always going to cost you money. Regional area, remote area, 10% yield, chance of making it neutrally geared, potentially positively geared. And what if you even go to a different place? Let's say, I don't know, it would have to be an extremely remote place, but maybe that yield is like 12 or 13%. You're well ahead of the market there. Why wouldn't you just go invest in those places? right? It's because that's not the only thing that comes out of a property investment. Yield is one aspect. Growth is the other aspect, or capital return. This is when you buy a house at, say year 1 or year 0 when you buy, and let's say year 5, right? You buy a house at, I'm going to use round numbers, it's much easier, $1 million. And in year 5, you've sold it for, again, let me use round numbers. So 5% year on year on year would end up being, let's see, 50,000. So 250,000, 1250. So you've made $250,000 on that house in 5 years. That's at a 5% growth rate. Now, which places achieve a 5% growth rate? Well, it depends usually, but growth is usually stronger in places with a greater critical mass. And that translates to capital cities. Why do they grow stronger? Well, it's because everyone wants to live there. It's because they have more prospects for jobs and work and optionality, which is very important. So if you lose your job, you can find another job. And often it's also because of family effects, community, we've got other people who live here that we know, that kind of thing. People want to go to the cities in general. A city is like a magnet and it's attracting more people there. And that's why cities generally have capital growth that's relatively strong compared to regional areas, but there are exceptions, right? And this is where we get to as far as how do you make a good property investment choice. If you look at a city and you look at value over time, yes, it might go up by 5% per annum, right? And it generally will look like that. That's probably the key point. We're talking about stability here. Stability is a different thing. So there's growth, absolutely, but there's what the picture looks like on the journey there. So let's say this is a 10-year journey, right? And it could easily be a longer time. But in a capital city, you'll see little tiny blips along the way. Sometimes growth will be better, sometimes growth will be worse, sometimes growth will be extremely minor. But what you generally don't see is negative growth. And if you do see negative growth, it's small and it's for a very short period of time. And so you buy in a capital city and you can be pretty certain that over time your investment is going to be worth more and more and more money. And so as a result, due to negative gearing as being a tax incentive for most people, people will take the known outcome of losing money through rent not covering all the property ownership expenses because they know that this picture is more than likely to sort of develop over time. And so capital cities are considered safer in that regard. The capital outcome over time generally outweighs the negative gearing outcomes over that time. And you can be pretty sure that when it comes time to sell, you will actually sit on something like this. Now let's consider that. Let's consider the example of a regional or remote area. This is where you need to be very, very specific about the area you're looking at, because regional and remote areas could do this. Right? Now let's say that, just for argument's sake, is a trend line representing 5%. But at any point in time, you could be here, you could be here. And the difference between that and that is negative equity, or a loss in capital value, or an extremely good result in terms of banking huge capital uplift. And the reason why you get higher yield in regional and remote areas is often a result of offsetting the risk associated with the less known or less certain capital growth outcome. Because in these scenarios, you really need to be following the market to understand when the best time to sell is and when the best time to not sell is. So it's less certain in the future. It's really about knowing the present conditions. It's also taking away your optionality by investing in a regional area. What you're doing is you're saying, I cannot have the ability to sell whenever I want, knowing that it's sort of just marching upwards year on year on year on year. And I generally have that freedom to sort of cash in my investment if I have to at any point in time. What it's saying is that if you go into that investment really what you want to be doing is making sure you have the option to only sell at these points in time. Because if you're forced to sell, as in you don't have the option due to your circumstances, you will lose money or you'll get a bad outcome. You may not lose money, but you may not make very much money, right? So yield is offsetting this picture. So where you see higher yield, generally you have less certainty with your capital growth outcome. And that's very important because when you look at yield across different places and property types, you will see what is actually the nature of that market. I'll do some examples here. Right, so if we're looking at, let's say, capital city, regional, remote, then let's look at commercial, specialised. Now, specialised can be like an NDIS property, where it's really only relevant for the NDIS people.